Hi everyone, this is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students. We are again back at the IPSA World Congress in Brisbane, and I am really happy to have with me here today Ozge Kemahlioglu from Sabanci University. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It will be very nice to talk to different people from the political science community here.
Yeah, and our topic today relates to many things that we've covered at the conference already, but has a different perspective. We are talking about creating policy uncertainty through media control. So I think everyone knows what uncertainty is, but what is uncertainty when it comes to politics?
Here I refer mostly to the results of policies that are promised by politicians. So when they, before the elections, during the campaigns, or during the period between two elections, when politicians, especially incumbent politicians, talk about their policies, what they promise, what kind of policies that they're going to implement after the elections, if they get re-elected, what kind of outcomes it's going to have. So people, experts, and depending on the knowledge about these types of policies, they have some idea about how these policies are going to turn out. Especially, for example, with respect to economics, you can take different policies, you can implement different policies, but their results can be quite uncertain. So here in this research, I try to analyze how media control can have an impact on these uncertainties. So if the incumbent, for example, enforces control on the media, they can influence what the media can say about the outcomes of these policies can be. Of course, the opposition will have some limited knowledge, or the experts can have limited knowledge, but if the media is under tight control by the incumbent, they might not be able to reveal this information. Of course, now we have social media, so that can have an impact on how much effect this tight control will have. But depending on how much access the population has to media, the control on the traditional media can have a lot of impact. So if you're, for example, at the opposition, if you cannot appeal to the population because of this media control, you cannot, for example, dispute the arguments of the incumbents about what kind of outcomes their promised policies will have. This is the kind of relationship that I try to analyze. So what affects the incentives of the incumbent to enforce this control on the media, so that they will be able to have more say on the outcomes of the policies that they promise.
So what are the incentives? What are the main reasons?
So I look at the relationship between the median or the pivotal voter. So I'm using a game theoretic approach here, and it can be the median of the electorate, or it can be a pivotal voter of the incumbent, because depending on the dimensions of policies, or depending on the number of political parties, there might be different pivotal voters that might have an impact on the elections. So here I look at this relationship between the incumbent and the pivotal voter, or the median voter, in terms of the conditions under which the incumbent will want to impose control. And what comes out of this analysis of the interaction is that when the distance between, when there are a couple of parameters that I analyze. One is the value of the control of the government for the politicians, and the other is the position of the incumbent politician, and another parameter or variable is the median voter's position. So what I find in this analysis is that if there is a non-linear, it's going to be a little bit technical, but I'll try to explain it clearly. There's a non-linear relationship between the value of office, value of controlling government for the politicians, and their incentive to impose control. So what comes out of the analysis is that when the office is really valuable for the politicians, voters know this, and they know that the politicians can lie. So controlling the media does not have an impact on the reliability of the information, because the voters know that the politicians can lie, they don't believe it anymore. So then when the politicians know that the voters will not believe what they promise or what they say in the media, then they have no incentive to impose controls on the media. When the office value of office is at intermediate values, the location of or where the incumbent is located is not going to have any impact. They will always impose control. And when the office value is really low, when the position of the incumbent will matter a lot, and the parties that are close to the center will have no incentive to impose control, but the extreme parties will have an incentive to control, because then they can make they can increase their probability of getting re-elected again by controlling the media and by telling the voters or by revealing information to the voters about their policies.
Mm-hmm. Can you maybe give us some examples from your current research? Which countries are you looking at?
Basically, I'm doing a quantitative research in the empirical analysis. So I include all the countries that have some competitive elections. So it is hard to pick that sample, pick those countries, because of course I use typical indices like Polity4 or Freedom House Index, and I try to pick countries that have some meaningful competitions. But there's of course a disagreement about that in the literature, what cutoff, boundary you will need to take. So I use also different samples to see how the results change according to that. But so in the theoretical sense, it should be countries that have some type of competition in the election. So the elections should matter. That's why the incumbents should care about the outcome of the elections. But these can have, apply to countries like, for example, European countries where you have consolidated democracies. Would they have any incentive to introduce control on the media? And also countries like, for example, Turkey, that is at the boundaries between competitive elections and not competitive, not fair elections. So in those cases where you care still about the election results, but where there can be restrictions on the elections, you would still want to look at the interaction between the voters and the incumbents. And would the incumbents in that case have an incentive to impose controls on the media is the question that I'm asking. Or like, for example, Venezuela, or it might drop out of the sample because now it's too authoritarian, but at least in some periods of the analysis, because I'm looking at the time period, so in some periods of analysis, it's in the sample. So in those time periods, like for example, in 2001, in 2002, did the incumbent politicians have an incentive to impose controls on the media is the question that I'm asking.
Mm-hmm. But maybe because I think this is an issue that a lot of students also face. Sure. Which cases should I include? Which should I exclude? How did this process look like, and on which basis did you decide in the end to include countries or exclude them?
So basically, any country that passes the threshold that I take in terms of competitiveness of the elections are included in the original analysis. Then when I decided to look at because this is a statistical analysis, so I needed to control for the median voter. So I used the median voter's position in the analysis, and I first used Latin American data because I had the standard data from Latino parameters that I could include in the analysis. So I started from Latin American countries, analysis of Latin American countries. In the original analysis, I was looking at policies on redistribution, so I didn't need to take the median voters' position, but the distribution of income in the countries. There I had the whole country, the whole world as a population, and include only those with competitive elections. In the second one, when I looked at the median voters' position, I only started from the Latin American countries. So in the presentation, for example, that I presented here, I used Latin American countries, but I will include other countries when I include the data from other surveys. So any country with competitive elections will be included in the extended versions of the analysis.
Mm-hmm. How did you come to this topic? I know that before this, your research was more concentrated on clientelism, exactly. which is related in a way, but observes, I'd say, another causality mechanism, basically. Sure. How did you make this turn?
Yes, definitely. Media is not a topic that I study normally, but I was looking at the relationship between income inequality, redistribution, and democratic backsliding. that was the starting point. I've always worked on distributive politics, clientelism, how it affects the relationship between voters and politicians, the linkages between politicians and voters. And then, of course, we have this discussion now in political science and in public about these gradual backslidings from democracy into authoritarianism. Again, Venezuela is a country that we analyze. I'm from Turkey. Turkey is another country that we analyze. Hungary, Poland, there are these cases that are discussed a lot in the world. US is also a country that people have started to analyze. And then, there is also big literature on how redistribution, income inequality is related to democracy, democratic breakdowns, democratic transitions. And there I did not necessarily see a direct relationship between distributive politics and how these democratic breakdowns or these gradual democratic breakdowns were occurring in terms of backsliding. So I was starting to get interested in that, try to understand this relationship between distributive politics and democratic backsliding. But then I found myself in this very different position. I was looking at the policies I was trying to analyze the policies that incumbents were promising in terms of redistribution. Again, it relates also to something that is discussed a lot recently, populism. So, of course, populism is also in rhetoric and also in the populist politicians, when they come to power, they also need to implement policies, and they talk for the people when they use these populist rhetorics. So do they show this in their policies that they take? These were all the issues that I was looking at, and then I started to be interested in how, not only in the policies that they implemented, but how they presented to the voters. And that's how the information revelation came into the analysis. So how much information would they want to give to the voters? Would they want to restrict the information environment? Would they want to impose some restrictions on the public discussion, on the opposition, in terms of how much they can reveal information about the policies that are taken in the government, in terms of how much information will be revealed to the voters? And then that's how the media control came to the analysis. It's because that's how the information can be restricted in terms of the information that can be given to the voters, in terms of what kind of outcomes the policies will have. Because most of the time, for example, populist politicians claim that their policies will benefit the people, even though they might not. So how do they convince the people that their policies will redistribute and how it's going to benefit the people? It happens through the media, through information revelation, and that's how I came to this focus of analysis.
I think one very important component here could actually be the question of how you conceptualize media control, because there, as I would assume, different ways of more direct and indirect media control. How do you look at this?
A very good question. Theoretically, I look at any type of control. So it can be direct control, indirect control. In terms of measurement, I basically use varieties of democracies measurement that looks at how much they say space can be allocated to the opposition in the media. In terms of there's a question on direct controls on the media by the incumbent, restrictions on the media by the incumbents, by politicians in a country, and also indirect censorship by the journalists or the people involved in the media themselves because of the way they are threatened by different means. So there's an index in Varieties of Democracies project on the control of the media, and I basically use that. But again, this is just traditional media that I look at. Of course, there is a social media component, and yesterday, for example, in the panel, I received a very, I think, good question about how this availability of alternative social media can have an impact on this, because especially the educated people can turn to the social media when they know that there's a lot of control on the traditional media. But there's going to be a variation in terms of the population, because probably low-informed people, lowly educated people who are not interested in politics will not make that choice and turn to the media. It will be the more educated, more interested people that will turn to social media. So then you can see also differences across countries because of this possibility. To the people where you have, or in countries where you have more educated, more interested people, this control of the incumbent might not work because they can have alternatives. But then, of course, the governments can repress the social media too. So there might be a reaction through that. Whether they will be able to do that or not is going to have an impact on the outcome.
We have actually one question from one of our viewers right now. Gabriel writes, it's an important matter, or whether it is an important matter in your research to also discuss the format of the state, whether it's federalism, unitarism, or the format of the government, parliamentarism, or presidentialism.
I do not directly include this in the analysis. I assume that the incumbent can control the media when they can, but of course these institutional factors are all constraints on the incumbent. So if you have federalism, you can have different state governments or different subnational governments that might have more freedom in their own administrative units, or if you have presidentialism versus parliamentarism, there might be different constraints on the incumbent in terms of how much they can control the media. But again, in terms of the presidential versus parliamentarism debate, it might not be these distinctions, but it might be, for example, the legislative control. So if the incumbent has full control over the legislature, whether it is in presidential or parliamentary system, then they will be able to impose control more effectively. So again, the more or the larger question is how much the incumbent is constrained by institutional factors, by partisan factors in terms of how much control they can use. And federalism is definitely a very important, factor that I don't directly analyze in this. But it's, for example, in the empirical analysis, it should be controlled for. It should be controlled for as a variable.
I guess in your research you also kind of, even though you have one distinct causality basically that you look at, that still it is also possible therefore to trace how actually it is possible to have several developmental states from a free media to a constrained media and to a media that is controlled. Because there is a lot of discussion in political science that we do not see as many revolutions anymore as we saw before, but there we talk more about erosion and deconsolidations. I guess that we also have these slow processes for media.
Sure.
How do those look like?
Exactly. When you look at the, for example, quantitative data, or when you look at the case studies, you definitely see this slow changes, and then sometimes it might not even be in a single direction. Of course, there are some improvements in some periods, and then some erosions in terms of the freedom of the media as well. And that's also something that I wanted to analyze from the perspective of the incumbent politicians, because the same even politician might have different incentives in different time periods. So how does the incumbent how do the incumbent's incentives change as a result of this different dynamics in the electoral coalition was one of the questions that I wanted to analyze. And of course, in some countries, this slow erosion of the media freedom ends in the breakdown of democracy. In some countries, there can be a change. So, for example, you can say that, for example, in Argentina, there was an erosion of media freedom, and then with a change in the government, you can say that at least the dynamics change. So you can say that the media freedoms improved with the turnover in the government, or at least because the same incumbent did not hold power, the tight control was challenged. So yes, over time again there might be an erosion, but at least with a change in incumbents in the government of the politicians that are controlling the government, it became more difficult to continue in this process of erosion. So the turnover in the government through the elections prevented further erosion, though it can happen again.
So you would actually say that in many countries the agents, the politicians are stronger than the structure, basically, in a way. So a new incumbent is not running with the structure as its predecessor has created, but basically is able to reestablish the situation before.
I think what happened in some countries when you talk about these democratic erosions or slow breakdowns, backlashes, is that an incumbent who was elected through competitive elections, as more time passed in government, they started to control the institutions. They started to control different institutions of the state, and with more control, they were able to impose controls on the media or in different elements of the electoral process, of the political process. And of course, a change in government, if it happens, I'm thinking of, for example, here in of Argentina, of course, there were the Kirchner governments. The more control they had, they could control the institutions. But then, of course, there was a change in government to Macri's government, and then a new incumbent cannot control the government as the previous, for example, government that controlled, or as the politicians that controlled the government since. I say from 2003 to 2015, when you control the government for 12 years, you get hold of the institutions, you then can use these to control the media or other aspects of the political process. But when you're in government after being elected, then even if you have the same incentives to control, you have to build it again. So the change in government can put a brake on it. Again, whether it's going to repeat or not is going to probably depend on other social forces, whether the electoral dynamics change or not. That's what, for example, analysis that I looked at shows. If the electoral dynamics change, the new incumbent might have different incentives in terms of how much they want to control the media, or they might have the same. So then it can repeat, the process can repeat itself, but it carries the potential to change.
Yeah. One very important component, I think you've mentioned that before in the beginning already, is social media. So can you also give us an idea of what exactly is now different through social media than it was before?
As I said, I'm not an expert on media, so I came to this research topic through another angle. Yes. So I cannot talk about the specifics of it, but in terms of, again, the incentives that the politicians face, and in terms of the constraints the incumbent politicians face, of course, social media is challenging, but the incumbents, if they have a lot of resources and if they control the institutions of the state, can put restrictions on the media as well. But because of the plurality of it, it can be more difficult. And of course, we know that people use their own networks to have access to information. So the people who will choose to not use the traditional media because they know that it is controlled by the incumbent will go and choose their own media sources in the social media. So it's, I think, a good opportunity to provide alternative information. But the people who use the traditional media will again use the same networks in the social media, so they will not have alternative information. So only the people who choose to go to alternative information sources will be able to have access, but those people who do not understand that the information that is revealed to them is a result of the control by the incumbent will not go to the alternative media sources, so they will not use it.
Yeah. One issue that has been raised in the last year was also that the costs that the government has through constraining not only traditional media but social media. How high is this effect? Because there are several discussions going on that actually for authoritarian countries countries where there is a much media control incentive, they can actually not afford it because it's too expensive.
Yes, I'm sure there's variation across countries, how much, and it depends on how much resources they have, and also it depends on the population, I think, because the more the population has access to the sources outside the country, the more expensive it will be. And it depends on the education, it depends on the languages spoken by the population. If you have alternative languages, alternative language-based social media, then of course it will be much more expensive for the politicians to control social media. So it depends both on the incumbents' resources as well as the population's resources.
Looking a bit more at the bigger picture, what is because you've also talked about like these several different focuses for you personally, also as we have listening to us several young scholars and students from all around the world. What is your motivation basically to follow up with these questions and personally?
Sometimes the motivation comes from the research itself. So you see that there is something that is not studied and you want to study it. You see that there's an interesting question that arises. Sometimes it comes out of politics itself. Like, for example, obviously a lot of people started to look at these backsliding cases because there are an increasing number of these cases around. So you see it happening in different parts of the world, in places that you wouldn't have expected. So how many people would have expected that you would experience this in Poland? So this is an interesting, surprising event that's happening, very worrisome. It has important consequences. So then sometimes it is the empirical events that make you analyze these questions. Sometimes it's the literature. You see that there's something that is not answered and you start to dig into that and try to understand what's going on there. Sometimes it is theoretical, sometimes it's empirical. Sometimes you see that nobody has studied it and you are curious and then you want to just collect information about the empirical, you want to collect empirical data on it and analyze. Sometimes it's theoretical. You realize that nobody really wanted to answer that question and you started to answer that question theoretically. So it can be different. There can be different motivations.
Professor Kemahlioglu, I want to thank you a lot for joining us today.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It was great to talk about research, about political science questions.
But maybe if you allow us, there just appeared one more question on my screen. So before we end this, maybe we let Brian ask his question. He said, may we also know the influence of the audience or having high channel loyalty to specific controlled media channels?
Possible. Again, it depends on the, of course, history of the media relationships in a country. It depends on the information that the audience will have about the different mechanisms. So again, the tighter network you're in, the less information, alternative information you're going to have. So you might continue your loyalty to the audience, but then the audience that is more informed will know about the, for example, changes in ownership, will know about the events that lead to self-censorship. So the audience who will have information about this will be more willing to change. But again, the less informed audience will be less willing to change. So you tend to see clusters, the more informed audience looking for different alternative information through their networks again, but also the ones, another cluster where there's lack of information, there's more trust maybe in the politicians and also into media sources, and then they're not going to look for this alternative information. But that's definitely a very important aspect to analyze.
All right, then thank you also for asking this last question by Brian. Thank you again for being here with us. Thank you for all of you for your questions and for watching us today. I wish you a great stay here in Brisbane and all the best for your research.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for the very nice, interesting questions.